Out of today's video, we're going to be ranking all 43 hypercharges in the game, from the very worst all the way up to the very best in a tier list. So over half the brawlers in the game now have a hypercharge, so I think it's important to put them in a tier list so you guys know which ones to buy, even with coins, and which ones to avoid or just be really disappointed in if you end up getting it out of a star drop. So before we jump into it, make sure you guys are subscribed because we're getting so close to 300k subscribers and I appreciate all the support, and it takes a ton of time to do these tier lists. So without further ado, let's jump into the first brawler. In the F tier, we have Sprout. Sprout's hypercharge has been pretty much useless since it's been introduced. The main reason being is because it's literally useless except for in Heist, and Sprout isn't good in Heist. So when are you going to get value with it? Pretty much never. So in the F tier, we have Miko's hypercharge. So with this hypercharge, it's really awkward to use it. I don't even think it's that good because by the time you land, a lot of the time the opponents just go so aggro, they either end up dying or they just end up running away. So I just find it incredibly hard to get value. Next up in the F tier, we have Pearl's hypercharge. So with this hypercharge, has just never made sense since the introduction. Most of the time it knocks people out of that burning radius, and sometimes when people even enter the burning radius, they don't even get any damage, which is just a crazy glitch which has been out since the introduction of this hypercharge. It's terrible. I just don't know how they've not reworked it. So in the F tier, we have Nani's hypercharge. So one of the new hypercharges, and boy does it completely suck. It's painful because I really enjoy playing Nani, but the hypercharge is terrible. All it does is it makes Nani's peep bigger with some additional damage, but I just actually think a lot of the time it's harder to hit with this Nani peep. I don't know what it is with it. It just makes the super worse. Lastly, in the F tier, we have Primo's hypercharge. So the other good thing about the hypercharge is the stat boost, but when you take a look at the actual hypercharge super itself, it's absolutely terrible. I just hate it. I actually feel like sometimes it's worse than the actual super, and they even said in Rule Talk that they would make the super radius bigger, and they didn't. So I feel like it's actually really hard to get value out of this hypercharge, and I think it's going to be F tier. Now moving on to the D tier, starting off with Brock's hypercharge. So this recently got buffed from 750 damage to 1000, and I actually feel like it's improved a little bit, so I might be sleeping on this, but at the same time I'd rather just go with the normal Brock super. I was just wishing they did something a little bit different because it's either going to be broken or trash. So we have Ems' hypercharge. So this hypercharge, just plain and simple, sucks. I'm sorry if you're an Ems main, but it's terrible. So with the super, you can push back people, deal some additional damage, but I just don't think it's enough. When you compare to other tank counter hypercharges out there, they literally rip through tanks, while this one just feels like you tickle them. Next up in the D tier, we have Squeak's hypercharge. So I know I overrated this in the sneak peeks, and I thought it had value, but it just feels like so many times wherever you place your first super, the second hypercharge super is just so far away. I've played so much Squeak, and I'm yet to get any value with it, even on a high save. So I think this hypercharge sucks. Next up, we have Charlie's hypercharge. So sometimes you can get value out of it, mainly because of the spiders. You know, typically you want to play Charlie against tanks, which is going to be useful. Then the spiders that spawn out of this hypercharge can counter those sharpshooters and other things. So it's quite versatile for that reason. But then again, all it is a gadget on top of the cocoon already, so it's not the greatest. And lastly in the D tier, we have Jean's hypercharge. So with Jean's hypercharge, you can pull up to 3 players, but a lot of the time it's actually a hindrance. The only time you can really get true value out of it if you switch star power to Spirit Slap, but for the most part it's actually a negative, pulling more than one person. So yeah, it looks cool, but it's not actually that good. So now moving on to the C tier hypercharges, starting off with Shelly. So Shelly's hypercharge, all it is her super but bigger, so it's not that good as a hypercharge, but because it charges quickly and you can deal a lot of damage with it, I think C tier is pretty fair. Next up, we have Tick's hypercharge. So recently this got a big buff to the hypercharge rate, hence why I'm buffing it up a little bit, so you can sometimes get value out of it. A lot of the times people won't run into the mines that explode after the hypercharge. The only good thing is that it's super fast, but for the most part anyone with a brain cell will probably take this out pretty quickly. Next up, we have Angelo's hypercharge. So you can move with your super when you pop this hypercharge. Still, I feel like the hypercharge rate it just takes forever. You probably only get one hypercharge a game, and then when you do pop the hypercharge super, because you're a sniper, you're actually really far away from people most of the time, so it's really hard because people just run away from you, so you just can't get value out of it most of the time. So in the C tier, we have Colt's hypercharge. So the only reason it's in the C tier is because of how fast you charge it. It could be a good difference maker in game modes like Heist, but the hypercharge super itself is pretty lackluster, so I think C's fair. Next we have Belle's hypercharge. So all that it does is the super homes onto a target, which isn't really that great, plus the hypercharge rate has been nerfed in previous updates, updates, but I think it does pair pretty well with Bell, like the additional movement speed and damage does help Bell in quite a few interactions. Next up in the C tier, we have Fang's Hypercharge. So I wanted to put this in the D tier because it takes over 4 supers to charge this, especially in this type of meta. It's like impossible to get, and Fang just isn't the same brawler that he used to be, but there are those occasions where you can really get those amazing team wipes because of damage boost and the fact you can go through walls. So I think this is a good rating for him. Next up, we have Cordelius' Hypercharge. So the Hypercharge super itself is pretty good. You can deal a lot of damage and you're pretty much guaranteed to win every single 1v1 inside that Shadow Realm. But I felt as time's gone on, as I've played a lot of Cordelius, you don't actually get many Hypercharges in a game because for the most part you want to be super an opponent and then killing them, but you don't get any Hypercharge charge whilst inside of that Shadow Realm. So I think it does take Cordelius quite a while to rack up the Hypercharge. Next we have Spike's Hypercharge. So all that it is Spike's super but bigger, but it pairs really well with the mythic gear. Sometimes it can take a while to cycle through to it, but I think it's essentially a mini Lou super and you can get a lot of control with it, so I think it's fairly decent. Next up we have Bull's Hypercharge. So without the Hypercharge, I think Bull would easily be an F tier brawler. It absolutely carries him. You can cycle through to it pretty quickly thanks to the tank trait as well, and you can make so many good plays. You literally tank everything when you pop super and then pop Hypercharge at the right time. You can make some crazy plays. So now we're going to be moving on to the B tier, starting off with Rose's Hypercharge. So the Hypercharge super itself isn't like completely broken or anything, but the additional slow and of course it's mainly the stats, because you've got that shield and then you have the speed boost on top of that. It makes for a very dangerous Hypercharge, because you think of previous metas where Rose would get a max speed, it would break her. So just that speed bonus altogether is the reason why it's B tier. So in the B tier we have Poco's Hypercharge. So a new addition. The only reason why it's B tier though is mainly because of the Hypercharge rate. It only takes 2 supers to get, but I still feel like the Hypercharge super itself isn't like anything crazy good. You can get some good value out of it sometimes, but I don't think it's really buffed him up too much in the meta. Next to the B tier we have Maisie's Hypercharge. So the Hypercharge super itself, you can make so many amazing plays with it and get team wipes, but the main problem is with Maisie, it's so incredibly hard to even just charge up to it because her main attack just plain and simple sucks. So I think if they change something with her main attack, I think you'd realize how good the Hypercharge is. Next up we have Jackie's Hypercharge. So with this you send a big shockwave and it slows people for a couple of seconds. The reason why this is so good as well is because, you know, brainless people can just literally pick up this Hypercharge Jackie in Brawl Ball, and even if they keep dying, eventually they're going to get that Hypercharge super from just literally taking damage. So that's another reason why it's so good, but you can just make team wipes with this Hypercharge pretty easily in Brawl Ball. So in the B tier we have Barley's Hypercharge. So with help of his Hypercharge, it's actually buffed him up easily towards the A tier in the meta, and the Hypercharge super itself is actually pretty good. You can get some good consistent damage and some fast damage as well. The damage lands pretty instantly. My only gripe is that you'll maybe only get 1 Hypercharge a game, but that can be the difference maker with Barley. Next up we have Surge's new Hypercharge. So with this one, it's a little bit weird because it doesn't actually affect the Hypercharge super itself. It's from his main attack. I think it's the only brawler with that mechanic, I believe, but the split attack is actually pretty good. Again, the biggest gripe though, you've got to have ammo available. You can't just like get that additional boost from your super alone, which with most brawlers you do. You don't need any pieces of ammo, but I think you can make some really game-changing plays with it, and I think it might bump it up to the S tier. So we have Crow's Hypercharge. So with this Hypercharge, it's completely broken inside of Heist. You use the Crow Hypercharge and you stand still on the safe after you've jumped, and you can deal nearly 50% to the high safe with the Carrying Crow's star power. And there's other instances where you can deal a lot of damage as well, and they've buffed the Hypercharge rate not too long ago, so I think B tier is a pretty good spot. Lastly in the B tier we have BB's Hypercharge. So it only takes a couple of supers to charge through to it, and I just love the speed and the shield boost with this. It means you can just charge at people so quickly, and the team wipe potential is there with BB. So that's why I like certain Hypercharges, because you can just run through teams. So now we're going to be moving on to the A tier Hypercharges, and these ones I would recommend buying as well. So we're going to be starting off with Edgar's Hypercharge. So with Edgar's Hypercharge, I think without it he probably would be an F tier brawler. You can make some really good plays with Edgar's Hypercharge, but I still feel like it doesn't solve the problem that he gets countered too much in this meta, but it's still a good one. Next up we have Sandy's Hypercharge. So this was completely broken upon release because you could cycle through to it so quickly. It's since been nerfed and it's much harder to get, but still the Hypercharge super itself is broken. The fact that you and your team get a speed boost for 10 seconds the entire duration of the Sandy super is crazy. The additional mute as well can be really helpful, but it's a very good hypercharge. Next up, we have Colette's hypercharge. So although you might think it's a little bit lackluster, the damage you can deal to the high save is crazy. 25% with every super. That alone deserves to be A tier, but mainly because of the fact that you just shred through tanks. You get it pretty quickly as well. You'll get multiple in the game. It's a very good one. So we have Nita's hypercharge, so you get a much bigger bruise bear. It's faster, more HP, and it charges with only 2 supers. So with all of these reasons, it absolutely has to be A tier because Nita in Heist is a complete menace. Next, we have Buzz's hypercharge. So with his hypercharge super, he literally becomes Spider-Man. You're able to make so many game-changing plays. You're able to get up the map and create some pressure, and you can stun lock people if they're close to a wall. So I think there's a lot of versatility with this, and it just allows Buzz to be even better. Next up in the A tier, we have Jesse's hypercharge. So with this hypercharge, you get a big scrappy turret, which is pretty good. I think for the most part, though, that's all that it is. It just wastes an opponent's ammo, and the main reason why it's good is because it only takes 1.5 supers to really get this hypercharge super. So for that reason alone, I think it has to be A tier. Next up in the A tier, we have Tara's hypercharge. So with her hypercharge, it's a much bigger Tara super, and it breaks open so much of the map, which is really underrated because I feel like at first a bit skeptic, but after realizing Tara's got some decent range and it does break open the walls, so then it allows you to counter those tanks even harder. The great thing about it as well is it only takes 2 supers, so as long as once you get that first super, which is pretty hard, that you hit the pool and cycle through to your next one, you should be good to go. So I think it's a pretty good hypercharge. So we have Piper's hypercharge. So I love this one mainly because it's so versatile. It can either use it just to jump and get away because you get an additional few bombs with your super. You can use it literally to jump on someone, get a knockback, and destroy the terrain when you land. So you literally can turn into a sniper assassin with this hypercharge. So it easily has to be A tier. Next up, we have Lou's hypercharge. So with this hypercharge, you instantly freeze someone with your super, and to me, that's just completely busted. Ever since it's come out with one of the first few batches, I think it's just been game-changing for Lou, because the reason being, once you throw that onto an opponent, you pretty much kill them, or if you don't kill them, you cycle through to another super or another hypercharge super, and the chain is there. And you know, if you have multiple Lou supers on the map, you literally controlling the entire objective in hot zone, etc. It's just a must buy. And lastly, in the A tier, we have Rico's hypercharge. So I wanted to put this S tier, but mainly the map pool does affect whether this hypercharge is good, but on the right map, this will just absolutely carry. I can't stress how many times I've not even done like a good super. I don't even know where the opponent's is, but because I've just spammed the super into a wall, it's just flown across the map and it's just ended up getting a team wipe. So for that reason, it has to be close to the S tier. Okay, so now we're jumping into the best hypercharges in the game, the absolute S tier. You must buy these if you have 5,000 coins. So to start with, we have Leon's hypercharge. So although it does take a while to cycle through to it, I think the hypercharge super itself is busted. The fact that you can shoot while staying invisible is just such a broken mechanic, so it's easily S tier. So in the S tier, we have Frank's hypercharge. So although the hypercharge super, I feel like a lot of times I do end up missing, I just think because you cycle through to it like in 2 supers, it's just crazy because you get a shield boost on top of already the tankiest brawler inside of the game. With a speed boost, you're pretty much guaranteed to get so much value and just run the opponents down from that alone. So yeah, I think it's busted. Next up in the S tier, we have Dynamite's hypercharge. So boy, can you get insane team wipes with this. You can deal some insane damage when you pair this with a demolition star power, and then of course you've got the dynamite that explode after the super, and sometimes it's literally unavoidable for the opponents, and then that can allow you to cycle to 2, maybe even 3 hypercharge supers in one sitting. It's just team wipe heaven. You must buy this if you're a Dynamite main. So now moving into the third best hypercharge in the game, I went with Gale's hypercharge. So a big drawback is that sometimes it can take a little while to charge through to it, but I've just made so many game-changing plays with this hypercharge. I've made so many team wipes, turnarounds, you name it, because it's literally impossible to not hit the opponents, and especially if you pair this with a stun star power, there's just so many times where I've deleted people across the map. It's just so good. Okay, so now jumping into the second best hypercharge in the game, we have Max's hypercharge. Main reason being is because the utility is absolutely crazy. If you combine you and your 2 teammates together, you're going to charge all 3 of you 3/4 of your super, which is just absolutely broken. And of course, the additional, like, you get more speed boost than a normal max super as well. I think it lasts like 4 times the time as well, so you're just going to be sped up for so long, and then even then you're probably going to have another max super thanks to your hypercharge. I just think it's so good, especially in pro play, and the pro players abuse it. Okay, so jumping into the best hypercharge in the game, I think there's zero doubts about this. Mortis' hypercharge is broken. It's absolutely insane. If I can make plays with Mortis with his hypercharge, you guys definitely too. I'm the worst Mortis in the game, and the team wipe potential is insane. I think the broken thing about it is that you can literally be a sniper with Mortis. You don't even need to be close to people. All you got to do is make sure that you're lined up with 2 people, which is easy if you have the mythic gear combined. And with helper this hypercharge super, you can deal up to 9k damage with 2 supers, which is insane. You're literally a tank counter with Mortis with his bats now. So yeah, I think if you've got the 5k coins, just buy it straight away. It's broken. It'll probably receive a nerf pretty soon. So yeah, that's going to be it for today's video, guys. Here's the tier list on the screen. Make sure if you post this anywhere, make sure to link that video at least. I think this is pretty accurate. Again, I combine all things in terms of the hypercharge rate, in terms of the team wipe potential. Is the hypercharge super even good? Do you get value out of it because they're a sniper, etc.? There's a lot of things to consider, but I think it's pretty accurate. Maybe a few changes, but that's going to be it. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.